观众朋友们好，现在是美国东部时间5月16日，这里是华尔街网报当时第一期节目。现在我们继续为您关注到的是跟中国以及世界有关的消息。今天着重为您关注到的仍然是中国疫情的最新进展。卫健委主任马晓伟在党刊《求是》杂志发文，表示要提前规划永久性方舱医院，省会和千万级人口建设15分钟核酸采样圈，每周定期检测，重点人群加大检测频率，引起外界关注。他谈及现阶段应对奥密克戎病毒株疫情说，中国是以抗原筛查加核酸诊断监测模式，以及增强隔离收治能力，比如隔离房源、方舱医院等对抗疫情。他说，现有加强版防控措施能够实现动态清零目标，对于绝大部分传播链基本都在潜伏期甚至更短的时间内得到控制。这篇文章还综述，中国从疫情发生以来到现在已经经历4个防疫阶段。第一是疫情初期突发应急围堵，以武汉为代表；第二是常态化防控探索，在2到3个潜伏期内控制疫情，主要强调外防输入、内防反弹；第三则是全链条精准防控阶段，以应对德尔塔病毒株为主，以南京禄口机场为代表；第4阶段则是全方位综合防控阶段，即为面对现在的奥密克戎病毒株。其中他特别表示，要进一步提升核酸检测能力、收治隔离能力，还要建设永久性方舱医院集中隔离点，确保一旦再次发生疫情可以迅速启用。说起疫情，再为您关注到的是上海的最新情况。根据来自中国媒体报道，上海政府今天预告，会在6月1日至6月中下旬全面恢复全市正常生产生活秩序。上海市副市长宗明作报告表示，下一步防控工作分为3个阶段。第一阶段是16日至21日，要巩固清零攻坚10大行动成果。第二阶段则是22日至31日，要向常态化防控转换，同时不断缩小封控区和管控区范围，直至解封。第三阶段则是6月1日至6月中下旬，全面恢复全市正常生产生活秩序。宗明还表示，目前16个区里面已经有15个区实现了社会面清零，封控区总人数已降至100万人以内。同时他还表示，在上海内部，巡游计程车、私家车可以在社会面清零的非中心城区和普通城区进行范围内通行，而在22日开始，地面公交和轨道交通将有条件逐步恢复运营。另外，今天多家从上海出发的客运航班开始恢复秩序。再为您关注到的是中国就业失业数字有关情况。国家统计局在今天公布了4月份国民经济运行数据。发言人表示，受到国际环境复杂严峻和国内疫情冲击超预期影响，工业生产出现放缓，服务业生产下滑，市场销售减少，市场新的下行压力有所增大。在4月份，反映工业生产的全国规模以上工业增加值年减 2.9%， 3月份是 5%， 今年以来增速一直下降。在行业类别来看，4月份汽车制造业的增加值年减 31.8%， 受到冲击最大，而外商以及港澳台商投资企业年减 16.1%， 影响最大。在服务业方面，全国服务业生产指数年降 6.1%。在消费方面，4月份社会消费品零售总额人民币2兆9483亿元，年减 11.1%， 其中餐饮收入大降 22.7%。在投资方面，1至4月固定资产投资年增 6.8%， 比1至3月份的 9.3% 下滑 2.5个百分点。房地产数据格为疲弱，全国商品房销售额下降 29.5%， 1至4月民间投资年较 5.3%， 比1至3月下滑3.1%。 而同时在就业方面，4月份全国城镇调查失业率是 6.1%， 比上月上升 0.3%。在16至24岁、25至59岁的人口调查失业率分别是 18.2% 以及 5.3%， 青少年失业率创有历史数据以来最高。根据来自路透社的报道，中国4月份房地产销售创下12年来最大跌幅。国家统计局数据公布，1至4月房地产销售额比去年年减30%。路透社依据公开数据计算，4月份房地产销售额比去年同期下降 46.6%， 这已经是2010年以来的最大跌幅。据来自路透社引述野村中国首席经济专家陆挺的意见指出，由于看不到重新开放的迹象，小幅下调贷款利率对于潜在首次购房者几乎没有诱因。中国官方在15日放出首购降房贷利率等措施，仍然难以提振低迷的房市。分析指出，现在仍然在于关键防疫措施没有看到尽头，再叠加失业率上升、收入减少、前景信息缺乏等因素，导致新房销售不断下滑。地产开发商普遍期待市场在第2季度可以触底反弹，同时下调投资者对全年房市销售额的预期。来自花旗的研究报告指出，销售恢复是流动性的关键，没有流动性，官方推出政策效果也大打折扣。而在永久性损失发生前，官方为了加速复兴推出实质政策有必要性。最后再要为您关注到的是电讯方面的消息。中国近期对于境外诈骗简讯电话严控，不管是江西、河北、河南还是浙江等多个省份，都纷纷发出通知，关闭国际和港澳台电讯语音接听功能。如果需要使用该功能，用户则需要自己申请开通。目前不知道是不是有更多的省份也会跟进。根据来自中国媒体的报道，河南、河北3大电信运营商已通知用户将分批关闭国际以及港澳台电话接听功能。而同时，工信微报报道，江西电信、江西移动、江西联通也发布联合公告，说是为了严防境外诈骗简讯，从3月底就将调整用户港澳台接收资讯功能。分析指出，上述省份可能只是试点，未来关闭国际以及港澳台短信接收功能可能会扩大到全国。但是，来自中央社的报道引述工业和信息化公共服务电话工作人员表示，目前还没有相关计划安排。最后再要为您关注到的是环球时报前总编辑胡锡进的最新言论。他表示，中国不可能像北京、上海这样的中心城市隔三差五反反复复搞风控，又说希望大家相信中国正在探寻动态清零针对奥密克戎的递进版。他说，在控制疫情和维护经济发展这2个方面，中国鱼和熊掌都要。他表示，现在4月份的经济数据出现了腰斩的情况，让人触目惊心，但是相信这一些数据中央政府也看到了。他说，在当前困难的情况下，国家一定可以统筹全社会的各种利益。胡锡进又说，中国现在正在探寻动态清零的递进版，在控制疫情和维护经济发展2个方面都可以做到。同时，胡锡进还说，中国怎么可能让北京、上海这样的城市反反复复搞风控？经济不要了，税收断崖下跌就印票子，企业爱倒闭不倒闭，老百姓没收入就喝西北风，我们的国家怎么可能会允许那样的情况发生？胡锡进还表示，新一波疫情3月才严重起来，迅速控制住具有战略意义，呼吁大家要有更多的耐心和信心。值得关注的是，柳叶刀发表文章，其中引述中国匿名省级卫健委官员说，现在新冠已经高度政治化，任何主张偏离当前清零路线的声音都会受到惩罚。又说，高层已经没有人真正听专家意见了，说实话，这对我们医学专家来说是一种羞辱。根据柳叶刀，另外一位官员也表达了类似的观点，说清零政策弊大于利，不符合成本收益，这一点我们都清楚。
In a new book, Getting China Wrong, Professor Aaron Friedberg of Princeton University re-examines the assumptions underlying United States policy of engagement with China. Has the policy of engagement failed? Has the West been exploited by China? What should the United States and other Western democracies do now in the era of strategic competition? Joining me to discuss is the author of the book, Professor Friedberg. Professor Friedberg, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for having me.
So your book starts with a fascinating account of the history behind the policy of engagement. Critics of engagement usually dismiss the policy as outcome of some sort of United States naivety or the handiwork of globalist profiteers. It's actually more complicated than that, right? I wonder if you can help us understand the historic context of the policy of engagement and who were the key architects of the policy?
I think the policy has a number of different roots. You can take the story back 30 years, you can take the story back 100 years. In one sense, the policy of engagement as it emerged after the end of the Cold War, so in the 1990s, really had its origins in the 1970s with the establishment of contact between the United States and China, the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China, so-called, and then the formal recognition of China in 1979. So there was already a degree of contact and engagement going back to the 1970s. There is, I think, a deeper historical context that I talk about in the book, and that is, if you look back over the history of the 20th century, the United States, in the wake of three different conflicts, was presented with the question, or U.S. leaders were presented with the question of how they wanted to reshape the world. So that happened after World War I. It happened again at the end of the Second World War, and I argue that it was the same question that arose at the end of the Cold War. And in each of those instances, the answer that American leaders gave was essentially the same. And that is, we would like to create a so-called liberal international system, which, as it was originally conceived, would be a world filled with liberal democracies that would be drawn together by trade, that would share common values, common similar institutions, resolving their differences peacefully, adhering to international law, and so on. That first effort, of course, failed. Woodrow Wilson tried to create the League of Nations after World War I. That didn't work. Towards the end of the Second World War, it became obvious that creating such a system was going to be impossible because the Soviet Union didn't want any part of it. So the onset of the Cold War, American policymakers, instead of trying to make this fully global liberal system, wound up constructing what I would call a partial liberal order in the West. So in Western Europe, the Western Hemisphere, and then Northeast Asia. And that was a collection of countries that over time were connected in the ways that the architects of the liberal order imagined, and most of which by the end of the Cold War were governed by, had democratic institutions. At the end of the Cold War, the idea was that this system could be extended now to encompass the entire globe. So the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire had collapsed and fragmented, and there was a hope that all of the countries of the former Soviet Empire could be drawn into this system, and that China, too, was already started down the path towards liberalization. So we could finally create this global liberal international system. And I think that's the backdrop, the deep historic backdrop and the ideological roots behind the policy of engagement.
Just to follow up on that thread of history, after 1989, then U.S. President George H.W. Bush famously said, the depth of the feeling towards democracy is so great that you can't put the genie back in the bottle and return to repression. That prediction didn't seem to hold up. President Clinton talked about how economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. So how did generations of U.S. leaders conclude that engagement would ultimately lead to China's economic liberalization followed by political liberalization? Can you help me understand the rationale? And where does that chain of logic finally break down?
There are a number of different sources that are fueling these beliefs and expectations. In part, of course, it grew out of the euphoria that accompanied the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was not something that most people had expected or predicted. It really did seem that history was coming to an end, that liberal democracy was spreading, throughout the former Soviet Empire and would eventually spread across the entire globe. So there was a sense of enthusiasm and optimism, and I think that's what's conveyed in those remarks by George H.W. Bush. And remembering also at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre, Americans saw Chinese students carrying a statue that looked like the Statue of Liberty, protesting repression and advocating for liberalization. So this was something that had happened or was happening in other parts of the world. It seemed plausible that it might happen in China too. But there were also what I would call theoretical expectations, rooted in social science and also in a kind of a deeper examination of history. The great political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote a book published in 1991 called The Third Wave, and Huntington showed how democracy had spread over the course of the previous century in waves. And so there was a belief that a third wave of democratization was already underway. In fact, that it had started in the 1970s. So there seemed to be a reason to expect that good things would happen and a similar process would play out in China. And then also there were a set of theories, again, rooted in empirical fact, that suggested that as countries grew wealthier, they would create a middle class. And the middle class historically had been the standard bearer for political liberalization. And that's what had happened in Europe in the 19th century. It had happened in parts of Asia, too, in the 20th century, including in Korea, Taiwan. So the expectation was that engagement, trade, investment would help China grow richer, and that as it grew richer, it, too, would develop a middle class, and it, too, would experience political liberalization. On the economic side, I think the beliefs of most economists and many people in business were that as China opened up its economy and engaged in trade, it would be compelled to move closer and closer to a market-oriented system, that was the only way to be competitive. It was the only way over time for a society and economy to be innovative. And so there would be these powerful forces pushing China towards economic as well as political liberalization. And that was the question, why these things didn't turn out the way people had expected. So why were these theories disproven? Why was China different? And the central part of my book is addressed to that set of issues. And the answer, in brief, has to do with the kind of counter strategy that the Chinese Communist Party devised in order to get the benefits from engagement with the West, with the United States, while containing as they saw it, undesirable political effects. And that effort has continued, of course, down to the present. And the CCP has been adaptive and flexible in the policies that it's pursued, but it's tended to keep its eye always on the main goal, primary goal, which is to maintain its monopoly on political power. And as part of that, it's also been careful not to open up and not to allow market forces to run wild and have their full effects, so that the party has always tried to keep control of the economy. So the answer to the question why it didn't work out was the CCP didn't want it to work out, and it devised and has implemented a strategy for preventing that.
You know, people sometimes consider the counterfactual. So, a popular different take on engagement goes, if the United States had blocked China from getting into WTO, if the United States had rejected China from entering the global system, then China today would have been much poorer, much more chaotic, and ultimately much more hostile to the United States. And that would have been a much worse scenario. I wonder if you agree with that view.
On the question of China's entry into the WTO, there are two ways of answering that, I suppose. One would be just taking the question at face value and saying, well, what would have happened if the United States and the Western countries had tried to exclude China from participation in their global economic system? Yes, perhaps China would have been even more hostile than it's turned out to be. Perhaps it wouldn't have been as wealthy. Probably it wouldn't have gotten as rich and as powerful quite as quickly. So maybe that situation wouldn't be, in fact, worse than the one we face now. I don't think that's really a satisfactory answer, because I think the choice was never so binary. It was not, should we include China or should we completely exclude China? I think the mistake that Western policy makers made was, having made the initial decision, for example, to encourage China into the WTO, there was a tendency then to stand back and expect that these forces of history would carry things along. And there wasn't enough of an effort to hold China to account and to modulate our engagement with China in accordance with their behavior. And that behavior grew worse from the Western perspective as time went on, but it took us a long time to acknowledge that. And so we've wound up in this situation now where China is both aggressive and hostile and deeply repressive at home, is pursuing mercantilist trade and industrial policies even more vigorously than it was when it entered the WTO. But it's deeply engaged in the global economy, and it's embedded itself really in the economies and societies of the advanced industrial democracies to a degree that makes it difficult for them to take steps now to protect themselves against its influence and against its unfair trading policies. So that's the dilemma we have now.
I see. And your book also devote a full chapter on Xi Jinping, and you argue that Xi Jinping is not a deviation from generations of Communist Party leaders, but rather an emboldened version of his predecessors with similar goals. I wonder if you can talk more about the CCP's key objectives. How has Xi Jinping advanced that agenda?
In my view, Xi Jinping and the CCP leaders have to be understood first and foremost as adherents of Leninism. So believers in the importance, the essential goal of maintaining the dominance of a single political party. And I think almost everything that they do, domestically, internationally, can be explained largely in terms of that desire and the pursuit of that goal. So in that sense, Deng Xiaoping was a Leninist, Hu Jintao was a Leninist, and Xi Jinping is a Leninist too. There have been changes in policy and emphasis, but I think the primary goals of the CCP leadership, really going back to Mao, have been, first, preserve the CCP's monopoly of political power. Second, build up China's so-called comprehensive national power, all of the different aspects or elements of power, including economic capabilities, military capabilities, technological advantages, and so on. And then over time, to begin to push outwards and change the external environment that China has had to live with, particularly in the last 30 years, when it's felt until recently relatively weak, and reestablish China, regain for China what the CCP leaders regard as its natural position as the preponderant power in Eastern Eurasia, and something that's become clearer under Xi Jinping, to build China's power and influence to the point where it is a truly global power on par with, and perhaps eventually even superior to, the United States. And I think those goals have been constant throughout. I would characterize the difference in Xi Jinping as being one of velocity rather than direction. I don't think he's pulled the steering wheel sharply to the left or to the right, but he has stepped on the gas and he's accelerated China's efforts to achieve these objectives.
So if engagement has not achieved its stated goals for the past few decades, what alternative policy the United States should employ for the future? I wonder if you can elaborate more on the concept of partial liberal order you laid out in the book.
Yes. I think the bottom line is we need to reconstruct an order or a system that is not global, that doesn't try to include all countries, but that is made up primarily of liberal democracies that share common values, that are integrated economically, politically, that cooperate strategically. That would involve countries in the Western Hemisphere, Western Europe, Northeast Asia. And in a sense, it would resemble the system that was in place when the Cold War ended. I think we have to sort of fall back to that. We've tried to create this truly global order, but that has failed. And we need now to defend what we have more vigorously than perhaps we've been doing. In the book, I talk further about a strategy that consists of 4 different themes or elements. One is what I refer to as mobilization. I think it's necessary, and it's starting to happen, that Western political leaders speak more candidly with their own citizens about the challenge that China poses and the way in which the current CCP regime is pursuing goals that are inimical to ours and challenging or threatening to our security and our future prosperity. Secondly, I argue not that we should be trying to contain China, but that we need to work harder at counterbalancing its growing power, strengthening our alliances and our own military capabilities to deter the CCP leadership from ever trying to use force to change the status quo. The third element, and maybe in some ways the most important and perhaps the most difficult, is what I'd call partial disengagement, not a total decoupling, but I think we have to go further. And we've, again, started to move in this direction towards separating our economy from China's to a certain degree to reduce our vulnerability to exploitation and also to Chinese efforts to exert leverage over our governments and over our societies. And the fourth and final element is that we need to wage what the CCP refers to as discursive struggle. We need to be blunter, I think, and more forceful in advocating for liberal democratic values and upholding the virtues of liberal democracy. And that's partly a matter of saying things. And of course, it's even more importantly a matter of doing things and making sure that our systems actually do function. And I think we also have to be blunter in pointing out the flaws and failings and dangerous characteristics of the current CCP regime. We can't pretend that it's going away, but we also shouldn't ignore those aspects of that system that are hostile and threatening.